Okay, so today we're talking about art financing, so loans and art as collateral. So instead of going to a bank and getting money and paying a mortgage, you're going to put up your artwork as collateral and all the complexities that come around it. But as in everything in the art market, just because it's complex, it doesn't mean we don't do it, right? We still do it anyway. So I thought I'd start with something very basic. So in order for fine art to be looked at as an asset class, we have to first understand how indexes work, right? And art has this very challenging frontier ahead of it, because no matter how hard scholars and mathematicians have tried, it's very hard to build an index around art. So I'm going to run you through a little bit of the history of what's out there and how you can look at art as an index and what's the best approach to it. The conclusion, and then we'll draw some conclusion. So today, when you buy shares of a company, right, you analyze an index, whether it's a Dow Jones, a Shanghai, a Nikkei, a NASDAQ. And the reason why those indexes work is because of the frequency of trades, right? So if you think in the art world, there isn't as much frequency in trading, so it makes it much more difficult to understand the true value at that moment of purchase or loan. So what I did is I did some research and I came up with the top 5 challenges. They're not the only challenges, but you can subcategorize other challenges within these 5. So let's go through these. The top 5 challenges. So we do need a regulated index, which shows us trades, how equities work. And there isn't really one right now. And even if there was one, how would it categorize art? Are we categorizing by artist? Are we categorizing by medium? Are we categorizing by frequency of trade? And there's more challenges to that, which I'll get to. Transparency. So private sales today currently account for roughly 40% of trades and are not recorded on any central index. They're not recorded, period, right? Unless you know the person who conducted the trade, whether it's Christie's, Sotheby's private dealer. So that causes quite a bit of a variance. 40% is quite a bit, and I believe that that's growing even more. Another area that I would subcategorize under private sales is there's lots of trade that occurs at art fairs now, and those are not recorded in any sort of index either. The next one is frequency, in which art trades isn't enough. So in order to understand how liquid an asset is, you have to continuously trade it and you have to monitor it and you build mathematics over it. Art just isn't traded that frequently. I mean, as we saw with the Van Gogh, all controversy aside, it just wasn't traded frequently enough. So nobody knew the true value. And for all intents and purposes, the true value is what it sold for last and more, depending on who wants it. The next one is mediums and popularity. So when I was at Christie's, one year it was really popular to trade silver, and another year we thought about closing the department, and then another year it was totally hot to trade Picasso ceramics. So regardless of the frequency of trades, there's a popularity index that needs to occur, I think, even before we look at an index of artist, medium, and trade. So that again is quite problematic. Then we look at, okay, what if we were to solve the challenges 1 through 4? Well, the artist is unique, right? So you're not going to compare how a Picasso trades and assume that a Van Gogh is going to trade in the same exact manner. So now you have to subcategorize your index by possibly artist and by medium as well. That said, what I would recommend is maybe look at the artist is unique and look at indexes by artists, right? So an indice by artist, and we'll use Picasso because that's the most frequently traded at this current time. We can then look at artwork from the same artist doesn't fetch the same value. So we all know that color matters, right? The density, the size, all of those things. So that adds another layer of complexity to any sort of index we would create, any sort of mathematic algorithm we would create. So this isn't obviously very positive, but there is hope here. So for me, what I say is we've just itemized a bunch of challenges, but challenges are opportunities. And in that sense, I would say, let's play a little what if. What if we were to create an index for Picasso? How would it work? You know, would you then subcategorize Picasso by object and flat and size and color, by portraits versus landscapes versus other things? Another what if game you can start to think about is, what if we were able to get some type of mild regulation on the art world where all trades did have to be announced or recorded, just like in the equity markets. So no matter what you traded, you would have to record it somewhere. You don't have to record the buyer or the seller, but you should have to record the trade. And that's, I think, where regulation could be very helpful for us, especially if we're looking to buy art in the future. So the what if challenge is something I always play when we add layers and layers of complexity, but it doesn't mean that we can't do it. So what I did here is, if we think back to our index and we say, the X and Y axis looks something like price versus time, right? So value versus frequency of trade. You would look at this and say, okay, so Picasso trades much more, but you can't compare it to a Van Gogh. So if you just look at Picasso flat art by era, right? Not by frequency of trade, but by era, you can start to create a trend. And Picasso just happens to have this upward moving trend constantly over the last 50 years. And it's been traded so much that you could actually build a Picasso index. And there's enough works out there. So starting simple, if we did build a Picasso index and we started in 1997, some quick math, and we bought a piece for $31 million in 97, and we sold it in 2015 for $179 million, over the course of that time, we would have made 460%. Which sounds fantastic, but hang on. If you break that up by year, it's only a 10% annual return. Here's the good and the ugly. You should still buy Picasso if you can afford it and you love it and it moves you. However, a 10% annual return is a bare minimum if you actually just invested in the Dow Jones Index. If you invested in the Dow Jones Index from 97 to 2015, you'd be somewhere at like a 30% return. So the big debatable question, does art provide returns equal to equity markets? No. Can it? Yes, but I would add a touch of magic to that, right? Just like we saw this past week with all of the books going on today. So 44, if I were an auction house, I would probably sell this slide with just the 460 and hope you wouldn't do the math, because they're amazing at marketing. But if I was actually going to convince you to buy or sell a Picasso, I would be more detailed and say, listen, it's only going to provide you a 10% return if you start mass collecting Picassos, right? Unless something out of the ordinary, right? You always have to add some type of variance for forces of nature. Forces of nature, war, theft, all of this stuff can cause hurdles in any market, including the art. So the methodology for creating an index actually exists, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce these, but it's actually called the KKK Repeat Sales Aggregator. I've added a link to this and in your workbooks where you can actually read the case study that these mathematicians created to prove that it is possible to create an index by artist and then by the artist idiom. It's not perfect, and they go into great detail talking about it, and you can actually download their Excel spreadsheet and pop numbers in. Highly complex. If you're not into math, I wouldn't go there. But you can download it. I think there's a small fee, like $2-3, and the link you'll have. But the KKV Repeat Sales Aggregator says you can do an index by artist, and then if the artist trades frequently, you can start to build trends and forecasts. However, if you have a Russian oligarch that really wants the piece, he can throw that index off. And that's where the magic of art happens, right? There's always unknowns. So the repeat sales methodology, if we were to look at it versus stocks, bonds, let's look at, for example, post-war contemporary and old masters and then compare it. So the KKV sales index charted post-war contemporary against old masters through the years of 1960 to 2013. Then threw on top of it stocks and bonds. And if you look at the orange line, which is stocks and bonds, you can see that old masters is just an underperform. And if you were lucky with certain pieces of post-war contemporary, it could almost equal your investment in equity trading. Obviously, you have to do a lot of research, right? You have to understand equity markets, but you could, if you wanted to invest in art and play it as an asset class or a collateral building or mortgage, alternative mortgages, I would rather you invest in post-war contemporary than anything. There's more frequency in those trades, right, than there are in Picasso. However, if you compare the stocks and bonds, it's just more reliable. But this shouldn't stop you from collecting art. Just don't pressure yourself to make money off of it constantly. So JP Morgan actually is doing some very unique things, and they've built a case study on this topic, an intense case study. It looks like it's only $6 to purchase the case study, where they said the lesson they've learned, and they've amassed something like a 33,000 piece collection. And they've amassed it across all of their offices, and they changed the artwork around, but they've also built algorithms around it. So they carefully select the pieces in this 33,000 collection to start to build indexes or study why we can't build. So I would highly recommend this case study. I actually assign it at Sotheby's Institute of Art when we talk about, can art truly be an asset class? And sometimes it can be. You just like anything else, you have to follow the market. You have to be highly engaged. So the lesson that this case study does say is using art as collateral has been profitable for private banks and convenient for its appreciative clients. But investing in art should be done out of passion and pleasure, not for financial reward. Stocks and bonds instead. So that's the conclusion, according to JP Morgan. But I always urge people to challenge conclusions. But they do have a phenomenal collection. I mean, just walk into any JP Morgan, hang out. So what we do always at the end is say, okay, well, where can I go to get an in-depth review of art financing, loans, art as collateral? These are the three that have a ton of activity online. I've personally worked with Borrow quite a bit. They are very good because they truly look at art as any other object of value. And they do remove a lot of the passion out of it. So if you're expecting that art financing agencies should be as passionate as you are about art, you're not approaching it in the right way. But what I would recommend is if you truly want to dive in and understand how these agencies work, I would recommend starting with Athena and the talk that is happening Tuesday and work your way across. Athena is a lot more, how do I put this? It's more refined in the way they operate. Borrow is about quantity and movement and fast pace. So if you're looking for very, very quick liquidity, I would recommend Borrow. But if you're looking for someone to really sit down with you and look at this as a long-term investment and something you can carry over the next decade or two, I would either look at Artemis or Athena. Artemis is interesting because aside from art as an asset class, they're now looking into cases where they would do art leasing, right? So I need a Picasso, but I only want it for like 6 months. Can I borrow it? Put it on my mantle. The funny thing is, sometimes auction houses, if you're a good enough client, will allow you to do that, but just a couple days. So art leasing is not a foreign or new thing. Charging for it and actually using it like you would use a timeshare concept is starting to become much more popular. And I can understand it. All of these three have home bases in New York, so you can definitely very easily reach out to them. The links, again, are in your workbook. And we have about 30 minutes, 20 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Elena, anybody else who can answer them? It's a round table. Questions?
More of a specific question. What kind of percentage against the appraised value of the art are they actually loaning?
The last time I did an art loan, it's roughly 45 to 60%, depending on the work, the significance of the work, and the term in which they have to either sell it or come up to pay it back. So the terms are much shorter than in your normal, let's say, going and borrowing money from a bank. Most of the lending agreements that I've looked at are 12 months, 18 months. They're very, very fast because remember, it's about popularity as well. So if, Basquiat is hot right now, he's not going to be hot in 20 years. He may not be. So if you need some money and you have 5 Basquiats, more than none, lending agents will loan you the money with the promise that you're either going to put these up for auction in the next 10 to 18 months, or you're going to pay them back. And most of the time, they put them up for auction.
Is the auction put up, I mean, is that because the art is for speculative purposes, or is it because the guests can't come up with money to buy it?
No, because sometimes you can negotiate a term where you assume a future value in 18 months and say, I have a Basquiat now. If you give me 18 million now, I can get a specialist or my private dealer to tell you that in 18 months this will be worth 20, and then there's a negotiation of how to split that additional 2 million.
So basically, we negotiate the loan.
Yeah. And all those terms can be negotiated, and they're highly creative agreements. Short, quick, highly creative. But everything is short term.
So you're saying it's about 12 to 18 months normally.
That's typically what I've seen. Yeah.
45 to 60% interest rate. What did they ask for?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the year. Depends on what's going on in terms of regulation. I wouldn't assume very high interest rates, but that's something more that you would look up online and see where you're selling and how you're selling, what all the brackets and stuff.
And they don't expect
tie the interest rate to a particular interest rate, like broker call and financial services.
Sometimes, but not. You can negotiate depending on the significance of the piece. You could have that. Yes.
If you take a loan out against the work, and then is that something you want to hush? Because then you want to sell it later. Can that work against you somehow, or is that
When you say hush, do you mean?
Well, I mean, should it be public knowledge? Should it? I mean, you tell me.
It's not any different if you take a loan out on, your wife's diamond ring, or if you remortgage your house. It's just not something you share. Just that you really wouldn't share taking a loan out. It's not any less or more private.
Would you say that just like as a percentage of transactions or business that come in, most people would take a loan out against their art with the intention of selling it, or are they usually just
yes.
Is it really like a traditional collateral? I think where they are they put it as collateral, but they are really trying to pay it off and take it back.
Most of the time it's for a future sale, but they want the money now, and there's a certain amount that they want guaranteed, and then after the sale, if it goes above that, they'll renegotiate kind of the terms of that. But most of the time it's based on the intent to sell at a future time.
So are there monthly payments that you have to make, interest that goes right back into the loan?
No, you can negotiate how you get the money, like 6 months and 6 months, but there aren't really. It's like 2 chunks is what I've seen, 2 huge chunks. Because of timing, it's safe to assume that the person who wants the loan wants it all immediately, because they're usually applying it to another business or debt or some situation. So it's more likely that the person who's loaning the works wants all of it as quickly.
What about custody of the art?
That's a great question. So custody of the art becomes its own separate complexity, and normally what happens is that the individuals who are evaluating the work, right? So here are all the players. You have the person who wants the loan, the person who can give you the loan, and then you have to have a neutral person who actually values the work, right? So valuations. And typically you want to stay away from auction houses because, again, you don't want them to know that you want to sell this. You don't want to be bound by one auction house. So that's where I think private dealers, specialists, appraisers.
We do them all the time.
There you go,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's where you have to have that neutral entity. The next thing that you want, and you want that to be entirely separate from all the other players, is where you're going to store the work. And believe it or not, a lot of the lending agents are okay with the owner storing it, which I completely disagree with. And if I'm ever in that pool of people or in that situation, I remove it and I put it into a neutral warehouse, that's bonded or that's got, certifications on temperature and all of that. That's the safest way to do it.
Who decides how it will be sold at the end of the term?
Repeat the question.
Who decides how it will be sold at the end of the term? I think it's just a discussion between the two. Sometimes you can ask the appraiser to give you advice if it's not a conflict. But I've also seen lending agreements where Christie's was the appraiser and then ended up selling it, which again I don't recommend. It's just, unless you're locked in, unless you know you're selling it at Christie's, you can have Christie's give you an estimate. However, be careful, because that estimate is going to be to the benefit of Christie's for a portion of it, because they want the work and they'll strategically advise you when to place it where it can sell. But if you don't mind all of it, they'll offer you estimates for no charge.
And issues of provenance or anything along those
They
lines.
do all that.
That comes, I mean, we're hearing less so much of works of art or cultural heritage items that
Yeah.
daily, some new item is being, from what essentially is being called into question as far as where it came from.
I mean, if there are huge gaps in a work, you run that risk, right? And you decide whether you really want the piece, and you run the risk of authenticity, or you don't. And that's, I think, where passion plays. But I would say, again, if you know where you're going to sell it and you're going to sell it at Christie's, you can save a ton of money and a ton of time if you just have Christie's do all the provenance work, do the research, and give you the estimate.
But
Or Sotheby's.
Optimize your return there.
You may, yeah. Obviously, you're not going to optimize return, and they're going to take their commission when it's sold too. So those are all the costs you kind of play with. You'd have to shop around a bit and see what's important to you. Prioritizing your needs. You have a piece that you want to first.
Does financing a work of art affect insurance issues at all?
Absolutely.
How
And
so?
everyone is different. I mean, I've seen Hiscox do something different than Lloyd's. Lloyd's is super strict. You'd have to call them up and talk through it with them, and they change their rules all the time. So it's not one rule set. You know, it's almost by artist, by piece. Where is the piece? All that, and where is the piece going to live? But the most trustworthy one I've ever worked with, obviously, is Lloyd's, but they do not budge. You know, it's their way and only their way in terms of storage, appraisals, all of it, even who sells it. So they'll take a piece as well.
A question. We were talking about the 40% of data being unavailable and suggesting it would be nice for it to become available. But we've actually moved toward becoming less available since the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act ensures the confidentiality. And so only by court order can you get even a redacted document for a past sale. So what do you imagine could make this data more available? I mean, it would have to be a new law.
Obviously nothing.
It's nothing. Okay.
It's job protection for dealers, specialists, appraisers. It's a
No, if appraisers would like to get the information because we're restricted too. When we do, we would have a lot more data at our fingertips unless we happen to know the dealer.
Yeah.
You have a combination of, asking prices and auction data and general knowledge and people
I would love for it, but unless there's a regulation that comes down from the government, it's a hunt.
Yeah, sometimes people will tell you.
Sometimes people will tell you.
If you ask them,
And if
sometimes
you know
they'll tell
enough
you.
people in the art world, you can create your own kind of.
But you don't, they might not want to be cited in a report, so it becomes a kind of hearsay. So it's certainly not something you can make an index out of now.
No, I mean, if you have a piece and it's stayed in your family for generation after generation after generation, and you're looking for a value, more times than not, you're going to get a great value because you know where that piece has been. If you've had a piece that actually has frequency of trade and it's older, it's an old master, and there are gaps, I would stay away from it. I would stay away from it. But if you find a lending agent that is willing to do it, of course you would. There's always a high level of risk as the pieces, disappear.
When you
Especially
take a
the gaps in
loan,
the 1940s.
Especially if there are gaps in the 1940s in Europe.
does the company have to do a public filing about the loan?
I'm not familiar with how the lending agents work, but whatever the legalities of loans are, I don't think they do. But you need all of those players because it becomes very complex. They have to do whatever legally they're bound to do, regardless of whether it's art or cash.
I'm just curious if you take out a loan against something and if there is a public filing, wouldn't the value of that loan be then public?
Sure. Sure. If it's a peer-to-peer, what if it's considered a peer-to-peer lending, which is now the new up-and-coming thing, right? There's a new site, I believe it's called Unbolted, and that's growing quite rapidly, actually. I think they're at like a $3-4 million investments from auction houses, actually, and I can't figure that out, but they do peer-to-peer, so I'm not sure what the laws are if you have a Picasso and I have 18 million, which obviously becomes more, right? And you want to put a loan against it. I don't know what's the law for that if I'm just loaning you some money.
To a friend.
Yeah, so I think peer-to-peer would move around that. Check out Unbolted.
But what's the difference between that and a bank? I mean, if you're lending the money.
Probably a bank would be bound to certain legal, whereas if I loan you money, it's just a contract between two people. I'm not running a business. It's like lending tree.
So if
I
I
don't know
do
if anyone's
blended
seen
lending,
it.
can't do anything about it.
Right. Unless it's in the contract.
Yeah, so all I can
There's a
do is,
contract,
I can chase you down for a contract, get lawyers, take you to court. All the work then happens between the two of us. And then that's what I've seen growing a bit, is the peer-to-peer lending part. Which I find fascinating, actually. I mean, in general, peer-to-peer lending, they're saying, is the future. That the need for banks is
What is this? Unbolted?
unbolted.
And it just matches people up who need to.
They do. They're like an
Lend
agent
versus
that
who
matches
needs a
people who need money and who have money, and they've now entered into art lending. So they already had this peer-to-peer platform, but now they're doing art lending. And Forum Auction House, actually, I think just
Do they just
invested.
act as brokers, or do they actually have like a Rolodex of like appraisers?
I think it's all algorithms. It's like matching. It's like the Tinder for people who need money.
But they need to value the art.
I think all of that happens on their platform in terms of, here are some service providers you can reach out to. When you build a brokerage online, like when you build an algorithm online, it's very much like, oh, I'm not going to recommend anything. I can just supply where you can go. It's just it just houses the platform in which you can work with someone else. Otherwise, they'd be liable for it. But I would check out Unbolted.
Unbolted?
Unbolted. BOLTEE.com. So Forum Auctions, I think just invested something like 2.2 million pounds in Unbolted.
The other one is Arthena.
Arthena, yeah.
Yes, and
Are they more content, or do they actually?
so they say
match?
that it's a first equity crowdfunding platform that gives individuals access to collect and invest with art world experts. And they're also very interesting.
Arthena, yeah. So it's ARTH.
Yes,
instead of
it's not
Athena.
the I was I was very surprised by the name, but anyway, the name is Arthena, unlike Athena that we have on Tuesday. But I've been speaking to Arthena as well, and I'm very curious to invite them to one of our future talks.
What's on Tuesday?
On Tuesday, one of the companies that Roxanna just mentioned called Athena Art Finance. So Nigel Glande, who is a VP there, it's a webinar, so you'll have to log in. But anyway, it's at noon, and I can send all of us a follow-up email today with the workbook that Roxanna also mentioned with some important links, and with the link to the webinar with Nigel Glande from Athena on Tuesday. We have a question from Asim online. He's asking, do you have a sense of what percentage of loans involved with works eventually going to auction?
The only experience I've had is works that are going to auction, so there's no such thing as default. right? The risk there is it goes to auction and it doesn't fetch the value.
Mhm.
But they double, triple check. When I was doing work at ArtNet for an art lending agency, we actually evaluated the work using the ArtNet price database and 6 different specialists, and we would be in a roundtable discussion for hours on just one piece. So we were very, very thorough, and that's what you should be looking for if you're doing some type of lending agreement, is what's the team makeup? You know, is it just one person? And we were actually bidding for the business against Christie's, which just had one specialist in the post-war contemporary department saying, here's the range. But I had built a team of 6 people that truly did a discussion of the piece, the color, the era. And the lending partner ended up using us instead. We also had access to the price, unlimited access. It's helpful, but it wasn't enough. We still needed the 6 specialists. We were looking at Gustin. We were looking at a collection of Gustin, Basquiat. Gustin and Basquiat, and it was something like a $5 million loan against a value of like 10. That's how safe they wanted to play it, with the promise that it would go to auction, you know, within 18 months. So then ArtNet Auctions would have gotten that loan, would have gotten that business as well, and we could have put it up on our site and sold it.
Why would a family or why would an owner opt to do it this way instead of going to auction directly and keeping 100% of the profits?
Why do people do it? It's the art world.
So these financiers, they're looking to make money on the 35% remainder or the 50 or 60%, not on any interest. And they don't ever expect to get paid back on the loan so that the owner can keep paying.
No, I've heard it happens. I've personally never done one where the person keeps the painting. It's not. It's interesting. It's like it's more of a pawn shop than it is like you know, a mortgage where you get to keep what you're financing. It operates a lot like a very, very luxurious high-end pawn shop where you're actually there. If you want it back, you're gonna have to come back and bid on it and buy it.
Is prepayment of the loans common?
Prepayment of the loan?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Say someone takes a loan out for 18 months to get the cash, and then 6 months later they pay off the loan.
I've never seen that happen. I've seen only they get the cash and it must go to auction.
So basically, they're trying to realize their value before the actual.
It's normally people who want a large sum of cash fast.
I guess you'd have to wait up to 6 months for the next appropriate auction. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And then the auction houses all fight, and whoever offers to put it up faster. And sometimes you don't want to put it up faster. You may want it to be sold in 18 months versus 12. All that gets discussed in the agreement. And the specialists that you hire or that you work with will give you that strategic advice as well. But I've personally never worked on one where there isn't money in advance, and then if it sells, there isn't money in advance. I've never worked with one where someone says, look, I'm going to keep Picasso and I'll just pay back.
Where do most of your clients come from for these art lending companies?
The art lending companies, where they come from, or where do the clients
Where do
come
the clients come from?
They're massive collectors. You'd be surprised. The 2 or 3 that I worked with were like major names. You'd be surprised. That I don't know if they're doing it because they need the cash.
Owners are usually seeking out the
Yeah.
companies, not vice versa.
Yeah, it's usually someone needs a loan and wants to use their Picassos. And maybe, you know, to your point, it's done so much under the radar that that's how they keep it a little more secretive as well. It's done very fast, and it's done in a very private space. I wish I could tell you, but I'm not supposed to. I've seen huge names where I'm like, you should not need this money, you know. But then I often wonder if they're doing it to just test how it works as well. But there are huge names.
Are they spreading out financial risk? Say if a work is bought in, it doesn't make the estimate. are they benefiting by spreading out that risk? Because that was something that was done in the real estate market on and off over the different decades. People that didn't need money,
Yeah.
Developers would get large loans from banks for the development, but they didn't. The companies didn't need the money.
Because the 3 or 4 that I worked on in the past were all real estate developers who were art collectors.
Well, this is
and didn't
the
want
same
to get
model
a loan from like banks and stuff.
It's the same
this
model.
was like a quick way to just turn it around, and they were building buildings, commercial, residential, large high-rises, mostly in the Midwest.
Liquidity is a wonderful thing, especially when you don't have it.
Yeah.
What do you think is like the relationship between a company like Athena or Artemis, which is like kind of a niche art lender, versus like Citibank, which has, or Deloitte, which have like very developed like art lending, subgroups. Like what is the pros and cons
I can only
there?
guess that the 3 that I mentioned are more niche because they focus on art, whereas Citibank and JP Morgan, you're kind of in a very small, you're not as important. It depends on the intention. And I would assume the exit strategy for a company like Athena or Arthena would be for a bank to acquire them, and create a large division. But most of these divisions, like at JP Morgan, they have a team of curators and specialists. All of that stuff is in-house, and it sits within their wealth management. I don't know how it works at other banks, but I can only assume it makes sense to put this entity within wealth management. And it almost becomes a service that you should provide, because if you're a member of the wealth management group, as a client, more times than not, you probably have significant artwork within your estate.
So there's been also, it just might be some conversations I've had, but a trend towards bartering.
Mm-hmm. You mean I have a Picasso, you have a Van Gogh, let's switch it for a while?
Yeah.
Kind of like a wife swap thing?
Yep, exactly.
Or a husband swap?
Exactly.
Really? I've never heard of that, but that's fascinating.
In the free trade
How does
zones.
Insurance work with that?
It's been in the free trade zone.
Really? Oh, so like within the warehouse they
themselves,
just like how they do in the wine cellars.
Exactly.
Right. So in California, how wine
that's
is
a perfect
traded.
analogy.
Is they've now built these very lavish wine, community wine cellars where you buy a room. It's like self-storage, but wine cellars. And then they have, tables and like a mini restaurant. And what you do when you're sitting at that table and you're opening your own bottle is you start to trade peer to peer. And there's no money exchange, so there's no tax or anything.
Right.
I have a Lafite, you have a Morgan, I'll give you one Lafite. And that I've seen happen. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah.
This one guy had 2,500 cases of Lafite from 1960 to 1986. And it was, and he had American, straight up American. And he was the owner of the Fairmont Hotels.
Oh.
At the time, before I think now it's owned by the Chinese. I'm not 100% sure.
They probably own the wine now too.
Imagine this: he wanted to offload 2,500 cases of Lafite. What would that do to the wine market? So he hired Christie's as a specialist to trickle it in, not to destroy that market. So over a period of I think 5 years, we would put up a couple of cases in every auction. So imagine if someone took their collection of Basquiat's, right? There's that one family in Westchester who were kind of like the unofficial adopted parents of Basquiat, and they have a collection that no one's seen. It's all his stuff that was never sold. They have it. What would happen if one day they just unloaded their living room with Basquiat? No house or dealer would recommend it. What would happen to the Basquiat market? Although if I were the owners, I would do that.
Why?
It might be strong enough to
Why?
absorb it.
Because I think Basquiat's overvalued.
Okay.
But if an artist is hot enough, it can possibly be absorbed.
It could be.
Yeah.
I mean, didn't Damien Hirst throw an
his
auction
own
and then
work.
buy his own work back because no one else was bidding on it? Wasn't it
did.
Sotheby's who put the collection up? Didn't he do his own sale?
He did do his
2008
own sale.
Was that
Yeah.
what it was?
There's one sale where Damien was part of a consortium that bought one of his works.
Well, that was the diamond skull. Yeah, that's a different scenario.
She's talking about the day after Lehman Brothers crashed
Yeah.
in 2008.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it still did well, but it was kind of like that, but that was the glut in the market.
Yeah.
And then it went
Precise.
down after that. But for Basquiat, it's maybe it would be okay.
Yeah.
Right now.
Hollywood keeps buying Basquiat's because
Yeah.
it's trendy right now.
Yeah, right now would
But
be.
when Hollywood gets bored and starts buying, I don't know, President Bush's artwork, which I hear is a fantastic collection. I hear he's a great artist.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of
His work is
specialists that come
beautiful.
back. It is beautiful.
It's
See,
very, he's very.
I've heard nothing but good
Yeah.
things about his art.
Yeah. it's
Who knows
interesting.
who's going to be hot? I mean, Basquiat's so hot. But if Hollywood gets, a little fickle, suddenly George Clooney starts to paint. Who knows? Hollywood. So great. Anyone have any other collections? Or sorry, not. That they want to give me?
What do you think?
That's Freudian.
Exactly.
What do you think about the buy lease back idea?
I have no idea how it
Like, how does
works.
that? Yeah, I'm just
just-
very
I-
curious how that works, just like from a functional, like logistical standpoint, how you like.
This is what I would challenge Athena or Artemis or Arthena about when they're talking about leasing or trading. Is I come from a school of learning where you're not supposed to be constantly touching artwork, right? So when I was at Christie's, we actually counted how many times one masterpiece was touched in order to minimize it so we could get better insurance rates and to protect the art. And we counted at that time, let's say 2010, we counted 15 times from the moment we picked it up from the seller to the moment we handed it over to the buyer. And that's just one time, one sale. Now, if you're constantly leasing, time sharing art, what does that do to the ultimate value of it? And how can you trust that everyone will treat it the same? So I don't
And you have to
agree.
control that process.
How
completely.
and who would control it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
Like
who would
whoever
control
runs,
it?
I'm very curious about how it runs from like a physical, logistical like standpoint.
Do you mean actually?
Control it just by setting premiums.
No, just like how do you find? I mean, because I read
And you just work it into the
Athena's
leasing
website, I
rate.
think that like they'll like you like if you're a collector, you say like, oh, like I want to buy this, then Athena buys this work or this group, and they lease it to you, and then you have the option to buy it at any time. I'm just curious, like how that works. Like how do they make money?
How do they what?
How do they make money doing that?
I know of a few when I was working at Skates a few years ago, 5 years ago. We were working with several companies that were doing art rentals, and that's I guess a little bit different, but then still similar in the concept. Both of the companies, there were two companies that were made major at that time a few years ago. Artremba, that is now bought by Absolute Art, and they're doing business through them.
Doing art rentals.
They're doing both art rentals and art sales. And there was another company which name I forget now, but I can find it in my records. The thing is that both of them were dealing with the new art, so it's with the young artists.
Contemporary or just
Very
emerging?
contemporary, young, so more say affordable art.
So it's more like
So it's just another
purchase
segment.
financing.
But I know that there are other companies that are still doing it now. For example, Asher Adelman is one of the figures that's been doing art leasing, and I think they're all quite successful. I think in general the idea of try before you buy is pretty good.
do you think people
depending-
usually buy it at the end of the lease, or
Some
do you
of
think
them do.
companies
We've
end
been
up with it at the end?
Some of them do, some of them don't. But for the young artists, even the rental fees make a lot of difference, and it's a nice commission to have. It's an interesting business model. And then it's not only for the collectors, because art rental companies, they're also lending art to the corporations. So for example, big offices or huge developments, they don't necessarily need to buy the collection, but sometimes they are choosing to have a rental of the collection and then change it over the time, which also works fine.
I mean, what I find so the components of lending exist. They just exist in different ways already. It's not something that's like a new invention, right? Someone buys a piece, they give it to a museum on loan. All those components exist. They just exist without the transfer of value, right? Or it's more of a valuing kind. Like, I'll give you this Picasso, you can have it for 10 years. You're going to name this wing after me, right? So there's this valuing. All of this happens. It's just about shaving off the complexities and looking and saying, how do we reorganize the structure of loans where it becomes a financial kind of activity more than just I'm loaning this, so that it exists. I think, you know, I'm not of the school where trading art frequently is acceptable. It's a masterpiece. You know, it's a masterpiece. So I was actually in a taxi heading back uptown last week, and somewhere around Chelsea Market there's this huge billboard and it says Monet, and then under it says Louis Vuitton. I don't know if you've seen this campaign. And for some reason, I was so angry when I saw this piece. Meanwhile, it's probably super normal for another generation to put these two together. For me, it's highly insulting to put a Louis Vuitton logo underneath a Monet and say, okay, we're just like Monet. And what that does, I can't fathom it, but I would love to know if anyone thinks that's acceptable.
Well, you know, from the point of view legally, if it was the other way around,
Yeah.
LV would be suing the hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's like watering down their brand. So
Yeah.
they'd be really
But their brand compared to a Monet is highly watered down. If you think about trade of a Louis Vuitton bag, there's enough frequency in that trade because you can buy secondhand and all of that, where you can actually probably do a Louis Vuitton index, purse index, right? But Monets, you're not supposed to be trading them or borrowing them, but you can borrow a purse. So that to me like triggered something where I'm like, God, that it's becoming normal to borrow, and they're trying to shove art into this mass fake luxury movement. But I don't even consider Louis Vuitton luxury anymore. You know, it's just like mass. You know, so I found that very infuriating. But then I go to universities and I teach, and there's like the Monet edition of a Louis Vuitton bag that one of my students walk in with, and I'm like, so it's okay for you, and I just don't know how to swallow this. So is it a generational thing, and will this become much more normal? Never mind that a student of mine is carrying a Louis Vuitton, but that's a whole other generational thing that I don't understand. So, I don't know, maybe through time and generation switches, these things will become a lot more accepted, just like transparency and laws will just seem outdated. I don't know. But one of the things I always look at when I look at companies like Athena or Artemis is, what is their end game? Their end game is not to provide a service for buyer and seller. Their end game is to collect data. And through that data, they could, through leasing art, there's enough frequency, they're like micro trades, right? There's enough frequency that perhaps they could have enough data to run an index and say, look at how many times someone borrowed a Picasso, look at how many times someone borrowed, a Pollock. And there is a possibility that they're thinking that. So they're data collecting.
And what will they do with that data?
I mean,
where's the
data?
Sell advertising?
Once you have the data, you then can sit down and do a lot of things. You can create indexes. You can sell your data to auction houses, to dealers, to galleries, to art fairs. You can do tons of things.
Form that associates the trading data with the projected price at auction.
Just want to mention for indices, there's also the May Moses Index, which isn't necessarily always a reliable tool, but for individual works of art, and it has to be the same work of art. It'll track the price, so it'll say, okay, it's sold in the Don's collection, or whatever it was, and then $179 million. So then, you allegedly can track a trend, although it doesn't necessarily account for similar works that may have sold, that maybe something else will never be sold, but something very similar sold at a certain time. And also then you have to account for the fact that something's not fresh to market, it could go down, or there are other factors that it doesn't do. Or you say, okay, the demand is so great that it doesn't matter that it's not fresh to market in that case, but just it is an attempt at an index, which occasionally is useful.
It's a good
in
starting
valuation.
point.
Yeah.
You know what we always used to say at ArtNet is the database is a great starting point, but you still need to have this conversation that you just had, right? You still need a room of people to discuss things that a database doesn't capture.
Mhm.
My assumption is that eventually, through art leasing, possibly, you'll have enough data where you can start to, create much stronger trends. And that to me is, if I were going to do a startup, my intent of a startup is not to provide a service for you all. It's to capture data, right? That's the ultimate goal I would have, is big data, and see how you're trading, what are the risks, and eventually I can generate really great analytics, and I can sell those analytics. I mean, ArtNet hasn't figured out how to create analytics, and they've survived over 25 years with just raw data.
They have analytics reports that you can buy. But
They're all done by hand, and they're not accurate.
You know,
Trust me.
yeah.
if you follow the Facebook model, just collect data however you can, and then sell it.
And then figure out what to do with it. It's more about mining right now than it is about anything else. Just grabbing data.
I'm a technologist, and I can tell you that the rule of thumb is just collect the data.
Yeah.
You may not figure out for 5 years what you're going to do with it, but just collect it.
Just collect it and make sure you can play with it. Data is gold. Data is the new gold, I'm assuming, at this point, right? Especially if you're in Silicon Valley, it's gold.
No,
And art data,
to
it's
blockchain.
That could be a T-shirt.
data is gold. Yeah, the art world is still, after all of this technology and two very significant technology moves, art still is one of the last bastions of the Wild West when it comes to data. I applaud that. I think it's awesome. But I also applaud the startups like Arthena that are trying to say, like, this should be more transparent. And I think Artsy says it as well, is they're looking for transparency and sharing. And that's the generation that believes in it, no matter what industry. I'm curious to see what happens in the next 10 years in terms of technology. But that's what I would think of leasing. It's just a faster way to collect data. They're recording all of those agreements. And they could probably tell you, listen, if Picasso is being leased 15 times more than Monet, you're probably better off amassing a collection of Picasso and owning it or something.
How do loans to museums work, for those of us who don't know? Do museums ever pay for the loan?
I mean, you're asking someone who lived in the auction world for 10 years, they never pay. Museums just don't pay, but their value in kind agreements are really fun to work on, right? So they're not very big on cash exchange, but they will do other very kind of creative things. I just don't know enough other than that. I've never actually worked at a museum to know, but I'm assuming, there's auction quality service, there's museum quality service, so all that must mean something. But it's its own. I always tend, whenever I do any lecture, I always put museums outside of the scope of the lecture, because A, I don't know enough about it, and B, there is a whole different set of rules when you're dealing with it.
There's also some tax rules that happen around museums that are very beneficial to the people who lend to them. So
And
I
they're
think even
always
if the museum's
changing.
not paying, the person is getting tax benefits by doing that.
And
I see.
those
Yeah,
tax
it's like a donation,
benefits
right?
change.
Kind of.
Yeah, I think if you buy
Interesting.
something
Mm.
and then you lend it to a museum
Right.
within the first 30
Both
days
federal
of
and
buying it, there's something funny that happens with taxes
That's
owed that is very beneficial to that person who bought it.
That's interesting.
I don't know the details of it, but
Right, it's
I know that
almost like
there's
building a foundation.
Yeah,
And you have
precisely.
to work on the tax, you have to work in that realm of nonprofit philanthropy.
Well, in the
Yeah, but it would
foundations
be
or what?
interesting to speak to someone from a museum.
It would be a great
Yeah.
talk. I would
Yeah.
be interested in learning how museums manage collections and curate and manage agreements with owners.
Yeah.
I mean, the talk now is that the Van Gogh is gonna, sorry, not the Van Gogh, the Da Vinci is gonna be put on some permanent loan somewhere. But it would be interesting to look at how that agreement would work if that's the case.
Do we